David Miller nearly gave his life for Emily Carter, stepping in front of a bullet and losing his left eye to save her. But while he struggled to survive, Emily found comfort in the arms of his best friend, Mark Thompson. What began as a story of loyalty and sacrifice twisted into a nightmare of betrayal, secrets, and a shocking conspiracy no one saw coming. David Miller's life seemed ordinary, yet there was something about him that made people admire his dedication. He wasn't rich or famous, but he was dependable. At 32, he had already built a reputation as someone who would do anything for the people he loved. He worked long hours at a construction company, often leaving home before sunrise and returning long after dark, covered in dust and exhaustion. Still, no matter how tired he always had a smile ready for his girlfriend, Emily Carter. Emily was the kind of woman who drew attention without trying. Her warm smile and soft-spoken nature made her well liked in their suburban neighborhood. She and David had been together for almost 5 years, and during that time, their bond had become the kind people pointed to as an example of lasting love. While others around them struggled with breakups and drama, David and Emily seemed solid, unshaken by the ups and downs of daily life. Their small apartment, tucked away on a quiet street lined with maple trees, had become a place filled with laughter, warmth, and comfort. On weekends, the two of them often hosted dinners with friends and neighbors. David loved to cook, while Emily handled the decorations and music. Their gatherings became a tradition, simple affairs with home-cooked meals, board games, and the kind of easy conversation that made everyone feel at home. At the center of these nights was always David's best friend, Mark Thompson. Mark had been part of David's life since childhood. They had grown up together, attended the same schools, and stuck by each other through good times and bad. To David, Mark wasn't just a friend, he was family. The bond between the two men was so strong that David never thought twice about including him in almost every aspect of his life. Naturally, Mark spent plenty of time around Emily as well. The three of them would go out to the movies, grab late-night snacks, or just sit around talking until the early hours of the morning. To anyone looking from the outside, they seemed like an inseparable trio. Emily admired David for his hard work and loyalty, though deep down she sometimes felt overshadowed by his selflessness. David put so much energy into taking care of her and maintaining their life together that he often overlooked his own needs. He didn't notice how Emily longed for excitement, for a spark that went beyond the routines they had settled into. She loved him, but she also felt restless, though she would never have admitted it aloud. Still, at this stage, nothing seemed wrong. Their love looked unshakable, their trust unbreakable. David believed his future was secure, and Emily played her part as the supportive partner. When neighbors watched them walking hand in hand through the neighborhood or saw them together at the local diner, they whispered about how lucky Emily was to have someone like David. People admired the loyalty he carried like a second skin, a quality rare enough that it made him stand out. What no one could see, what David himself didn't realize, was how fragile the foundation of that perfect picture really was. Beneath the smiles, beneath the laughter, subtle cracks were already forming, invisible to most but slowly widening with time. And before long, those cracks would open wide enough to swallow everything David thought he knew about love, friendship, and loyalty. It was late in the evening when David and Emily stopped at a small corner store on their way home from dinner. The air was crisp, the kind that hinted at winter just around the corner, and the streets were quiet except for the hum of passing cars in the distance. The store was nearly empty, just a cashier behind the counter and one other customer grabbing a drink. David bought a pack of gum and Emily picked up a soda, both of them laughing about something trivial, enjoying the simplicity of the night. Nothing about that moment suggested how quickly everything was about to change. As they stepped outside, the world seemed to narrow in an instant. From the shadows near the alley a man appeared, his face covered by a black mask, his hand clutching a gun. He moved fast, his voice sharp and demanding as he pointed the weapon directly at them. The flash of metal under the dim streetlight froze Emily in place. David's instincts kicked in before he had time to think. He shoved Emily behind him, raising his hand slightly in an attempt to calm the stranger. The masked man barked out demands for money, his words slurred with panic. David reached for his wallet, but Emily's sudden gasp caused the gunman to tense. In that single heartbeat, everything erupted. The gun went off with a deafening crack. and David felt a sharp, burning pain rip through the left side of his face. The force of the bullet knocked him off balance, sending him crashing onto the cold pavement. Emily's scream cut through the night as blood began to pour from David's wound. The masked man, startled by what he had done, fled into the darkness, leaving the couple in chaos. Emily knelt beside David, her hands trembling as she pressed them against his face, trying desperately to stop the bleeding. Sirens wailed in the distance after a neighbor called the police, but the minutes dragged like hours. David drifted in and out of consciousness, his vision fading, his body trembling from shock. He didn't know if he would live through the night. At the hospital, doctors rushed him into emergency surgery. The bullet had shattered bone and tissue, leaving irreversible damage. Hours later, Emily was told the news. David had survived, but he would never be the same. The shot had destroyed his left eye. It would have to be removed. His face, once strong and unscarred, now bore the brutal evidence of that night. The story spread quickly through the community. News outlets described David as a hero who had thrown himself in front of a gun to save the woman he loved. Friends and neighbors spoke of his bravery, some calling him the kind of man everyone should aspire to be. But while others praised him, David faced a new and painful reality. His life had been altered forever. The days that followed were filled with surgeries, bandages, and agonizing pain. He struggled with blurred vision, headaches, and the weight of knowing he would never look the same again. Emily stayed by his side at first, her face pale from sleepless nights. Yet even in those early days, David noticed something different in her eyes, a distance he couldn't quite explain. He had taken a bullet to save her, but beneath the surface of that sacrifice, something darker was already beginning to stir. Recovery was never simple for David. Each day felt like a battle between his body and his spirit. The hospital became a second home, a place of sterile walls and endless beeping machines. His left eye was gone, and with it went a part of his identity. Every time he caught his reflection in a mirror, he struggled to recognize the man staring back. Bandages covered most of his face at first, but even after they were removed, the scars remained, a reminder of the night his life had changed forever. At first, Emily seemed supportive. She brought him food, sat by his bedside, and tried to distract him with small conversations. But as the weeks passed, her visits grew shorter. Sometimes she claimed she was busy with errands. Other times she arrived late and left early, her phone buzzing constantly with messages she refused to explain. David told himself she was simply overwhelmed. After all, the trauma had scarred her too. Still, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away between them. When he returned home after weeks of surgeries and therapy, he expected things to slowly return to normal. Instead, he noticed how quiet the apartment felt. Emily no longer smiled as easily, and her eyes lingered on him with a sadness that made him uneasy. What hurt most was the way she seemed to avoid looking directly at his face. David tried to reassure her, telling himself that love was stronger than scars, but the silence between them spoke louder than words. During this time, Mark began appearing more often. At first, David welcomed it. Mark had always been like a brother, and his presence seemed comforting in the emptiness that now filled David's days. He brought takeout, watched games with him, and cracked jokes to lighten the mood. David thought he was lucky to have such a loyal friend, someone who stepped in when life had knocked him down. Yet there were moments that didn't sit right. One evening, David noticed how quickly Emily put away her phone when Mark walked in, as if she didn't want him to see something. Another time, when David stepped out of the room, unexpectedly, he caught a strange silence between them, the kind that made the air heavy. They both brushed it off, pretending nothing had happened, but the unease settled deep in David's mind. The distance between him and Emily grew wider. She stayed out late, claiming she needed time to herself. While Mark's visits became more frequent, David wanted to believe the best, to trust the people he loved most, but late at night he would lie awake replaying every detail of their behavior. He thought about how Emily barely touched him anymore, how Mark's eyes lingered on her longer than they should. He tried to silence those suspicions, convincing himself that trauma could make people act strangely. But deep down he felt it. Something was breaking. The loyalty he had given so freely was being tested, and the cracks in his perfect world were spreading faster than he could hold them together. The day David discovered the truth was one that etched itself into his memory with a kind of cold clarity that no scar could ever match. He had been scheduled for a routine checkup at the hospital, something Emily believed would take most of the afternoon. Instead, the appointment finished early, and David decided to surprise her. Carrying a bag of groceries in one hand, he walked back to their apartment with the quiet hope that a small gesture might bring back a sense of normalcy. But as he unlocked the door and stepped inside, the sound that greeted him was not silence. It was the unmistakable sound of whispered voices and hurried movement. His heart pounded as he set the groceries down, his one good eye scanning the familiar room. At first, he thought maybe Emily had invited a friend over to keep her company, but when he pushed open the bedroom door, the sight before him shattered his world. Emily and Mark were together, not as friends, not as allies in his recovery, but as lovers. The betrayal hit harder than the bullet that had taken his eye. The scene was undeniable. The woman he had nearly died for, and the man he had trusted like a brother, had crossed a line that could never be erased. They scrambled for excuses, stumbling over their words, but David couldn't hear them. All the nights Emily stayed out late, all the strange glances, all the excuses suddenly fell into place with brutal clarity. The truth had been there all along, hiding in plain sight, and he had been too blinded by loyalty to see it. Emily claimed she felt alone, that David had changed since the shooting, that she needed comfort Mark had been willing to give. Mark, in his own defense, insisted it had just happened, that it wasn't planned. But to David, their explanations were empty, a hollow attempt to dress up a betrayal that cut to the core of everything he believed in. The woman he loved and the friend he trusted most had chosen each other over him, even after he had sacrificed his own body to protect her. In the days that followed, David lived like a ghost in his own home. Emily and Mark didn't try very hard to hide what had happened. It was as if the secret being exposed gave them permission to continue. Friends who once admired the bond between the three of them now whispered behind closed doors, stunned by the scandal that spread quickly through the neighborhood. People who had once praised David's courage began to avoid his gaze, unsure of how to speak to a man whose heroism had been met with such cruelty. Inside, David felt hollow. He replayed that night at the corner store, the moment he stepped in front of the gun, over and over again. He had believed his love was strong enough to withstand anything, but he realized now that love alone was not enough. Trust had been shattered, loyalty had been mocked, and his sacrifice had been repaid with betrayal of the cruelest kind. The bond he thought would last forever was gone, broken beyond repair, leaving only a scar deeper than any wound the bullet had left behind. David withdrew from the world after the betrayal, his days blending into nights as he sat alone in the small apartment that no longer felt like home. The curtains stayed closed, and the television often played to an empty stare. Neighbors who once checked in on him now kept their distance, whispering about the scandal that seemed to hang over his name like a curse. Emily had left without hesitation, moving in with Mark soon after the truth surfaced. Their betrayal became public, and while they carried on with their new life together, David was left to navigate the ruins of everything he had built. What weighed on him most was not just the heartbreak, but the humiliation. He had been celebrated as a hero, a man who risked his life for love, only to be discarded by the very people he trusted most. His name was still remembered in the community, but now it was whispered with pity rather than admiration. He began to wonder if surviving that night had been worth it. The bullet had taken his eye, but it was betrayal that had stolen his spirit. Then, months after he had nearly given up on rebuilding his life, news surfaced that reopened old wounds. The police announced that the investigation into the corner store robbery had been revived. At first, David barely paid attention, assuming it was a formality. But when detectives reached out to him, their questions shook him to his core. They revealed that new evidence had come to light, phone records, suspicious withdrawals, and anonymous tips that pointed to someone he knew. Slowly, a horrifying possibility emerged. The masked gunman who had nearly killed him wasn't a stranger at all. There were threads connecting the attacker to Mark, threads that painted a picture of betrayal even darker than David had imagined. Investigators believed Mark had been in contact with the shooter days before the robbery, arranging a plan that was supposed to scare David or remove him entirely. Whether Emily knew about it remained uncertain, but the timing of her growing distance and the ease with which she had slipped into Mark's arms after the shooting now seemed far more sinister. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. What had once seemed like a tragic accident was now suspected to be a calculated act. David's best friend, the man he had trusted since childhood, was arrested on charges of conspiracy and attempted murder. The betrayal had not been born in the aftermath of the shooting. It had been there all along, festering in secret, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Emily, though never formally charged, could not escape the weight of public opinion. Many believed she had known more than she admitted. She insisted she had only turned to Mark after the shooting, blinded by grief and confusion, but few believed her. Her reputation collapsed, leaving her isolated even from those who once admired her charm. For David, the arrests brought little comfort. Justice might come in the courtroom, but it could not undo the scars on his face or the emptiness in his heart. He had given everything, his trust, his love, his loyalty, and in return, he had been targeted, betrayed, and nearly killed by the two people who mattered most to him. The bullet had changed his life forever, but the deeper wound was knowing that the betrayal had been planned long before it struck. And as the world moved on, David was left with the quiet truth that survival does not always mean victory. Sometimes it means learning to live with the weight of a story too cruel to ever forget.